Welcome everybody to Writers Writing on Psychedelics. We've got a really great lineup today of Francoise Bourzat, and I'm Julie Holland, and Chris Bache, Don Lattin, Tom Shroder, and Phil Wolfson. And we've just been joking with each other about whether we're going to go alphabetical or reverse alphabetical or what. I wanted to give the appearance of being random, but I'm just going to go ahead and sort of organize this. I'm going to speak very quickly first, and then everybody's going to have a chance to talk, and then we will hopefully have a lively Q&A within all of us. I'm talking first to give people a chance to figure out what the heck they're going to say, so you're welcome. I don't know what I'm going to say. So I'm a psychiatrist. I spent 9 years running the psychiatric emergency room on the weekends at Bellevue. I went to Penn undergrad, Temple Med, and Mount Sinai psychiatric residency. And I've, throughout all of my education, I remained very interested in altered states of consciousness and how those states could facilitate healing and change and growth. And I had my own experiences of adolescence and college and medical school that did nothing but firm my resolve that this is a thing, these medicines can be helpful. I want to reduce the stigma and educate people about these substances, and that I think that they can be tremendous catalysts for psychiatry. They can be catalysts for growth and healing. Further, the current treatment modalities we have that are legal and that are available to us aren't necessarily the most efficacious, most efficient way that we could go about growing and changing and learning. I'm very interested in this idea of sympathetic versus parasympathetic, that when we are in fight or flight, we're not really growing and learning and changing. You know, we've got a very clear vector and priorities, and there's not much time to be open to things like trusting and bonding and cooperating. That when we coalesce around each other and form civilizations, the way that's really done optimally is if we are in an open state, that we're not shut down by fear, we're not paranoid, that we are open to sharing and integrating with each other. And unlike fighting or fleeing, what it really requires is staying and figuring your shit out and working with other people and not running away. And I believe that things like MDMA and psilocybin and ayahuasca and ibogaine and DMT and things I haven't mentioned, and peyote, that these substances give us a different perspective and an opportunity to look at things, you know, with fresh eyes, or from above or from below, or to stop thinking about things in terms of up or down. They shake things up, and there's a lot of neuroplasticity happening, which I think is very important. But when the dust settles, we've got some new ideas. And I know that all the people here on this panel, we think about things and we have great new ideas and we write them down. And eventually, over months and years, they coalesce into something that we've worked very hard at. And we put it out into the world because we want to share what we figured out. And I will say that thanks to, you know, it's like on the shoulders of giants, but there were people who came before us who wrote books on psychedelics that we devoured and loved. And then we got to write books on psychedelics. And I feel very privileged to be in this lineage. And it was really hard to sell books about drugs for a long time. And, you know, my two, the ecstasy book and the cannabis book, they're both nonprofit projects, right? Like very little advance, proceeds fund clinical research. You know, mama did not get it like a new pair of shoes on those. But what happened over time, and thank you, Michael Pollan, but it did finally get to a point where publishers stopped saying things to me like, you know, drug users don't buy books. And, you know, it's like most of the drug users I know, second to drugs would be books. You know, like they are things that we like and we collect and we take in and we consume and we share with our friends. So I had to educate, and I bet you all did too. We had to like stand our ground and say, you know, people do read these things, people are interested. But certainly after Michael Pollan's book, And there's money in them dar hills. So the publishers, my latest book didn't really start out as completely about psychedelics, but it got to the point where they wanted the word psychedelic on the cover in the subtitle. And that was a complete 180 from my earlier experiences of trying to get somebody to give me money to publish a book about drugs. So I hope things are changing for everybody. I do want to talk more about the content of my book, but it doesn't have to be now. I really want to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. So I think I'm going to start picking on people to give their spiels, and maybe at the end I'll say something more, but maybe I won't have to. And we're going to go to Don Lattin.
Okay, let me set my timer here. So for 5 minutes. It's great to be here with all of you. What a wonderful group of people to spend some time with. So I came from a very different background than you, Julie. I was a newspaper reporter working for the San Francisco newspapers. And I went back and realized that I've actually been writing about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy since 1977, when I was a young, like 20-something reporter at the Chronicle and the Examiner. And I did some stories about all the information was coming out at the time about the horrific research that the Army and the CIA was doing into psychedelics. So I had my first real page one kind of Sunday story as a young reporter was, I think the headline was "Horror of U.S. Army LSD Tests." So I've been writing about that subject since then. And of course, I came of age in the late 60s and early 70s, so I did a lot of personal exploration with psychedelics. Much of it was what you might call recreational, but there was always a spiritual element to it. And so as a journalist, I was interested later on in the 80s writing about new religious movements and the whole spiritual counterculture of the 1960s. And one of the things that I noticed writing about Buddhist movements or people who are interested in Eastern mysticism is that a lot of times it was a psychedelic experience that inspired them to get into meditation. So I wrote a book, the first book I wrote for HarperCollins was called Following Our Bliss, How the Spiritual Ideals of the 60s Shape Our Lives Today. And it was kind of looking at not just the psychedelic counterculture, but the larger counterculture and new religious movements, everything from what was going on at Esalen to the Moonies and the Hare Krishnas and all of that. So I've always been interested in alternative spirituality, and psychedelics often fueled that or started people on that journey. And then I became the religion reporter for the Chronicle Examiner and then the Chronicle in San Francisco. And so I was writing about everything. I mean, from the Pope, on down, atheists to Zoroastrians. I mean, everything. But I was always especially interested in the search for higher consciousness, altered states of consciousness, alternative spirituality. That always interested me more. So the first book that I wrote that was really completely about psychedelics was the Harvard Psychedelic Club, which was a group biography of Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Houston Smith, and Andrew Weil, all of whom came together in the 1960, around Harvard and MIT. And I really loved that book. It was the first time I did a group biography. And I just loved the format and the storytelling and how these four lives came together and all the drama around that. And that book came out in 2010, and it did pretty well. It's the one book, I've written 6 books. That's the one that really sold. And so I was kind of chasing that dream for a while. My next book was another group biography called Distilled Spirits, which was a group biography of Aldous Huxley, Gerald Hurd, and Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA. And I took the story back and looked at how these 3 men kind of laid the foundation for what came later in the 60s. So, and that book, speaking of how you approach this as a writer, your voice, how much of yourself you want to put into your work, that was an interesting case because originally I wasn't going to put myself in that book at all. It was these guys are of my grandfather's generation. I didn't know them, but the publisher, which was UC Press, an academic publisher, suggested to my surprise that I make myself a 4th character and talk about why I'm attracted to Huxley and Hurd and Wilson. And I had some of my own experiences as a recovering alcoholic and drug addict. I've had a whole story with that too. And so that became part memoir and part group biography. So it was a very strange mix. And I really went into it kicking and screaming. I didn't want to write about myself. And I thought it was kind of presumptuous for me to put myself as a character. But they kind of insisted. And whether it worked or not, I don't know. Some people liked it. But so that was my second book. And then recently in 2017, I wrote a book for Synergetic Press called Changing Our Minds, Psychedelic Sacraments in the New Psychotherapy, which came out about a year and a half before another book with a similar title by Michael Pollan, which did a little bit better than mine. But I explored a lot of the same territory that Michael Pollan did in it was really looking at the clinical research trials that were going on, interviewing research subjects and scientists. And again, it was a struggle about how much of myself to put into that book, how my own stories to put in. And one reason I did that a bit in that last book is because, you know, as a journalist, you are going to people and their research subjects, patients, and you're asking them to talk about their addiction, you know, their PTSD, their suicidal tendencies. I mean, deeply personal stuff. And so I kind of felt that as a writer, for me to open up a little bit about my own struggle and some of my own revelations around these medicines, that was sort of in the name of honesty and full disclosure, it was okay to put myself into that book too. And it was always a struggle about how much of it to be about my experiences and other people's experiences. Because I'm really old school reporter. I mean, I was a dirty word. You didn't write about yourself, you know, in the old days. So it's been kind of an evolution for me to try to find my own voice and my own perspective on this subject. So that's probably enough for my introduction.
Great. Thanks very much, Don. You know, I didn't intro you with a bio, and I'm sort of hesitant to read bios before each person, Phil, but if you think that's what we should be doing, I will do it. Otherwise, I'd say
No, I think, no, we don't need to do it.
there's bios on the website.
Yeah.
Francoise, are you ready to speak? All right, unmute yourself.
Yeah,
and
thank you. Thank you. I always mute myself when other people talk, so yes. Okay, so let's see. My interest in psychedelic have come from the angle of psychotherapy and counseling. I encountered psychedelics before going into my own personal exploration in a psychotherapeutic framework in my late teens and early 20s. But when I moved to California in '81 from Europe, I encountered shortly after, a few years later, a group of people in the East Bay who were working with psychedelic, with essentially MDMA, MDA, mushroom, LSD, and ketamine in the context of personal healing, personal growth, groups, individual work. And that really interested me from that angle of supporting the psychological unfolding and healing of people, like the work, you know. I was not interested or even angled towards research or writing. It was just my personal process that started me on that track. And after recognizing the potency of my own healing with my own trauma, which I had plenty of, and my own expansion into my own spiritual understanding or experience, direct experience, and my sense of, you know, meeting my own potential and moving forward into my own studying, getting my master's degree in psychology and studying in various modality. I decided that I was really wanting to dedicate my life to being a counselor into this world of psychedelic. I did not pursue licensure specifically because I wanted to be applying myself to the world of psychedelics, and I didn't want to be constantly threatened by a license to lose. I purposefully did not pursue the licensure track. And I became an assistant of my teacher and guide and mentor, Pablo Sanchez, who was a Native American and Pueblo Indian man, whom had learned also and studied with Salvador Roquet, who was a known psychiatrist in Mexico and pioneer of ketamine usage. And I helped him. I organized things for him. He was the one holding the space, officially, and I was kind of there by his side for some years. And then we would work with people with these compounds, and we would guide groups. And I was doing a lot of the preparation, and we used to do a heartbeat test then, which was a test taking people into their own, fantasy world or reality, or their distorted perception of themselves. Very interesting testing modality. And then we would have all kinds of preparations, and the methodicness of the way people were taken into this process was really impressive, and the way people were supported during the process was very impressive, and the way people were supported on the other side of the process was very impressive. The way the integration was run, the way the specificity of each process was really sort of not dissected, but very deciphered, and then supported person per person, was very interesting for me and transformative. And I had gone through it, so I could then see what I had gone through as I was supporting other people with him. And then in the late 90s, I had the opportunity to go to Mexico and meet someone who was very, very immersed all her life in the work of sacred mushroom, Julieta Casimiro Estrada. She was a very good friend of Maria Sabina. She was in that tradition of the Mazatec, respectful and very sacred usage of mushrooms. And I started to be her, what we call an apprentice maybe, or a friend or a student, or a client. It's not quite the verbiage for that tradition, but I worked with her for over 20 years. Being very, very close to her work, and traveling to Mexico extensively, and myself, my family, my community, my clients, and we did a lot of exploration together, or I did under her guidance, and then collaborated with her. And she taught me a lot of her angle and the traditional cosmology of the Mazatec, and how they think of this work as a healing modality, as a doctoring modality, as well as a spiritual experience, which are very, very connected in their eyes. And then I continued to work with her and study with her. And then I started to, my first kind of breakthrough into the outside world, or whatever, public world, was in 2011. I was invited to go to the International Transpersonal Conference in Moscow, and I presented then on the Mazatec, and Stan was very excited about that, and there was a lot of interesting, wonderful people, of course, but people who were really catching that angle that had not been really expressed publicly before. And so I was invited to join the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco in 2012 to present a class on expanded states of consciousness and psychotherapy, and sort of explain or narrate my understanding of a possible way of handling these compounds in the context of psychotherapy and growth and healing. And that led to more classes at CIS and more invitation to speak at various venues. And then my student, Christina Hunter, supported me in writing this book that came out last year. We took some years to write. We were busy, and I was busy traveling and doing various things. And so the book came out a year after Michael's book. He loved the manuscript. He read it way before the book was out, in fact, and really supported it, and other people did. And I was very lucky to be mentored and supported by Ralph Metzner and Jim Fadiman, and as my mentors in the work, my friends, especially Ralph, for 30 years or so, was my very close friend. And so I was mentored and trusted and supported and felt like, okay, I had never written a book, you know, it was kind of my first attempt. I had been writing curriculums and trainings, and I've been training psychedelic guides for 25 years. So I was very much immersed into the um, training of therapists to be able to understand and you know, be educated in the framework of psychedelic psychotherapy. Um, but I had never really written a narrative. So that was an interesting process, and I'm really glad the book is out. It seems to be well received and provide an angle more in the bridging of the traditional framework into the Western world of psychotherapy. So I'm glad. My work, of course, is mostly about mushrooms, but I'm very much interested and have done a lot of personal as well as assisting my teacher with many other compounds. So I'm especially I've done a lot of work with ketamine. So I'm interested in continue to you know, write about this and talk about this and participate to conversation to try to bring a little bit more of the roots of this tradition into the world of research now that is unfolding and broadcasting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francoise.
Mm-hmm.
Can we hear from Tom Shroder, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, my story, my book really starts when I was maybe 19 years old, a college student at the University of Florida. And I, you know, discovered along with everybody else, the mushrooms that grew in the cow pastures outside of Gainesville, and we'd go and, you know, we'd go hunting for them, and then like come running under the barbed wire with a farmer out there with a shotgun and everything. But anyway, it was very evident to me early on that that these compounds were really important, and they helped me sort of grow up. And in particular, they helped me understand that you kind of could control how you felt about things. I mean, that you weren't like forced to feel something, you chose to feel it. And that was really helpful to me. And so I was really interested in it. And I lived in Sarasota, so I was home on Christmas break, I think. And there was some article in the local paper about this hippie who was building this wild house out in the woods east of Sarasota. And I could tell reading between the lines that this was a psychedelic journey this guy was on. So I was the editor of the Florida Alligator, the college newspaper. And we had a feature section. And I thought, well, this would be a great story for the feature section. So I sort of figured out where the house was, and I went out, and there's this guy, bare-chested, hair down to his shoulders, with a wolf chained up in the yard. And he's building this incredible house with these huge stained glass windows, and it's cedar and river rock, beautiful house. And it was just fascinating to me that he was like making the sort of psychedelic insight into something concrete, literally concrete. And so I interviewed him for the article, and I wrote a article for him. I think the title was "The Wolf Next Door" or something like that. And so that was fine. And I went about, you know, sort of with my own personal explorations, and I graduated from college, and I became the editor of the Miami Herald Sunday magazine. And I came across a story in the Tampa paper about this guy who's sort of like trying to be the Johnny Appleseed of ecstasy. And he like believed that this was like a breakthrough in therapy. It was going to change psychiatric therapy forever. And I was reading this article, and the guy's name was Rick Doblin. And I thought, Jesus, that's the same guy who was building that house. I couldn't believe it. And so I assigned a reporter to go over to the West Coast to do a story on Rick. and we ran it at the on the cover of our magazine. I think the headline of that was a Tim Leary for the 80s. And so, okay, so that happened. And then I became the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And this was many years later, about 15 years after that. And I saw a small story in the New York Times about Harvard was doing the first psychedelic research since they drove Tim Leary out of town on a rail. And it was being sponsored by something called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And the founder and CEO of that organization was Rick Doblin. And I just said, okay, this is unbelievable. This is the same guy. So I called him, and not only did he remember me, but he said he had just had shown the 2 stories that I'd done on him at a board of directors meeting. And his point was trying to be, here was this wild hippie who's now, you know, become part of the mainstream establishment. Well, not quite. He wasn't quite mainstream as he thought he was. But anyway, I said, okay, I've got to write this one myself. So I did a magazine article on, basically, he was trying to get the first clinical trials of MDMA for PTSD going. And you know, during this whole process, the McLean Hospital at Harvard, where he was going to try to do the research, changed directors, and the new director said, we don't want anything to do with this crazy guy. So they basically killed the research there. But there was this other guy doing research, a psychiatrist named Michael Midhofer down in South Carolina, and he was actually doing some trials. So I went down there and spent time with him and just fell in love with this guy. What a wonderful guy he was, and is. And it just seemed to me that there were these wonderful characters, Rick, and just an amazing American original. Nobody else like him, and a real visionary who, like, just completely on his own path without any kind of standard credentials or anything. Here he was about to change the world. Really rare thing that happens. And then Michael Midhofer, who is this incredibly wise, incredibly kind and insightful, very caring doctor, who made this his life's work, knowing what he was risking professionally doing it. And I just thought, this is a great story, and it needs to be told. And what it really needs, I knew that I needed someone who was going to need this therapy, someone who was suffering from, you know, all these PTSD symptoms that are just really terrible, to the point where, you know, at one point, this guy that I found, you know, was like sitting on his bed with his gun and with his pistol in his mouth. He's a former military guy. And then I realized that, you know, the book I wanted to write really was the story of these 3 men and how they came together, and the import of how they came together. And, you know, this other guy's name was Nick Blackston, and he was a Marine, and he fought in Iraq, and saw a lot of combat. Had his best friend literally shot out from under him because he was up in the machine. He was the machine gunner in a Humvee, and the driver, and the bullet came through the windshield, and the guy bled out literally right beneath him. Anyway, and plus he had the trauma of having these 12-year-olds start walking towards the Humvee, and suddenly they pull out AK-47s and start firing, And he has to blow away these 12-year-old kids with his 50 caliber machine gun. So he really couldn't live with himself after that, literally. And he saw the advertisement for the trial, and he happened to live near Charleston, which was where the trials were, where Michael's trials were. And so he ended up going there, and he was basically completely cured of this life-threatening illness that he had. So I just thought, I just wanted, Acid Test was the book, and I named it Acid Test because the echo of the great Tom Wolfe book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, but also because what they were doing with these trials was the acid test of whether psychedelics could really become part of mainstream medicine, I thought. You know, and literally an acid test is when you put acid on a metal to see if it's actual gold. And I thought that was an apt metaphor for this. So above anything else, I wanted Acid Test to be a story. I wanted to read like a novel. And it really goes back to the beginnings of the Western sort of understanding of psychedelics and bring it all the way up. And now where we are is where this is actually going to become an official medicine, part of the Western pharmacology. So anyway,
Great. Thank you so much, Tom.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing. I really appreciate what you had to say. Next, we're going to hear from Chris Bache.
Hi, everybody. I have a very different background from everyone who's spoken so far. I'm not a therapist. I don't have clinical training. I got my undergraduate degree from Notre Dame in theology. I got my PhD from Brown University in philosophy of religion. And I somehow managed to not do any psychedelics all the way through college and graduate school. It wasn't until after I started my teaching career in a modest state university in Ohio in 1978 that I was looking around for where to take my research, and I found Stan Grof's book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And that book changed the course of my life, as it has many of us. I immediately saw the philosophical relevance of Stan's work, not just the psychological, clinical relevance, but the philosophical relevance. So I immediately knew that I wanted to do this work. And of course, this is 78, so everybody had been fired from Harvard, and it was clear academics wasn't going to put up with any academic research on psychedelics. So I split my life in two, and I've made my living as a professor of religious studies, doing the things that professors do. But in my nighttime job, I began a 20-year journey working with LSD, following Stan's protocols for high-dose LSD therapy. And I ended up doing 73 high-dose LSD sessions, working at about 500 to 600 micrograms in a completely internalized, completely carefully structured and intensified with all the music and eye shades and with a sitter and all that stuff. And this became an extraordinary philosophical adventure. It led me to clearly differentiate in my work the difference between using psychedelics for therapeutic healing, using psychedelics for spiritual opening, and using psychedelics for cosmological exploration. And as a philosopher, it was cosmological exploration that I was interested in. So what I found was that working with this high a regimen, high a dose, and this is a regimen I seriously and sincerely don't recommend today. I would do it very differently if I were starting over again. But when you work in this highly internalized environment, you go through a series of death and rebirth experiences. And ego death is just the first of many deaths that I encountered in this process. And every time you enter a deeper level of consciousness and then over repetition stabilize consciousness at that level, eventually if you continue to drive forward, you're taken into a still deeper level of consciousness, and you have to go through a different level of death and rebirth in order to enter this new domain. And then the process repeats itself, and it kept repeating itself. It kept getting deeper and deeper through the years. Eventually, I stopped this work in 1999, and I had, about this time, my first book on psychedelics came out, Dark Night, Early Dawn, which is so buried in academic philosophical discussion that most people don't even recognize it as a book on psychedelics. So, but one of the things I did in that book is I realized for a philosopher, if you're going to extract the philosophical implications or the cosmological implications of these substances, you have to be willing to expose your personal experiences. It's just a prerequisite for doing psychedelic philosophy. So I wove my own psychedelic narrative in and out of the chapters in Dark Night, Early Dawn. But for the most part, I had to keep my psychedelic history hidden from my colleagues. I mean, my good friends at the university knew, but I never brought it into my students. I never, even though I taught courses in psychedelic research, I never let my students know that I was working with psychedelics myself. And it wasn't until after I retired and after I was no longer working for the state of Ohio and passed the statute of limitations for my psychedelic crimes that I began the process of writing what I think of as my most important work, which is, well, the publisher called it LSD in the Mind of the Universe. I called it Diamonds from Heaven, because in this story, I basically just lay out the journey from the first session all the way up to the 73rd session and just kind of lay it out stage by stage, just trying to give a narrative of the deepening communion with the universe that this work took me into, and the deepening layers of insights, not only in my own history, but more importantly, for reasons that I discussed in the book, the universe seemed to be using our time together to give me a major download over the years into human evolution and into where humanity is in its current evolution and where it's going. And this historically critical time we have entered, which I see as a time of giving birth to the future human, which represents a fundamental shift in the core architecture of the collective psyche. Really a shift that is a pivot point, a before and after point in our historical evolution. So I wrote that story. It came out in 2019, just in time for the coronavirus to stop all public appearances. And so I've been continuing to incubate this work. And I found that there's a level of integration that can take place before you talk about your experiences. And then there's a deeper level of integration that takes place once you begin to be publicly transparent about your experiences. And so I find that now, even though I stopped this work 20 years ago, it was 20 years in, 20 years digesting, 20 years, and then the writing of the book. Even though my sessions for this work stopped 20 years ago, my absorption and my internalization and my bringing this work forward in my own life as well as socially really is still unfolding. It's continued to deepen and play. So I write from an autobiographical perspective. I write as a philosopher, exploring these potentials. I had to overcome a tremendous resistance to do the writing that I've done because I was letting people into the deepest, most intimate, most private experiences of my life, one's relationship with divine, one's relationship with the universe in the most intimate form, especially since I knew all of my academic colleagues would just, sneeze at it and pass it over and, be not very supportive of it beyond my personal friends. But I did it and I feel good about it. And I did it in the confidence that we all are in this together. We're all in this historical period together. We need each other's experiences. We need each other's stories in order to deepen our own story as we go into this tremendously important historical crisis that we've entered. So that's my story.
Chris, thank you very much for sharing your story. I know you can't necessarily stay with us through the whole Q&A, but I absolutely appreciate what you had to say. And you are triggering a conversation that I would like to have about us sort of outing ourselves and what that process is like. But before we have that conversation, we're going to hear from Dr. Phil Wolfson.
Who will be outing himself as usual. uh, um, I grew up in small town Queens, New York for most of my childhood. And I had the pleasure and privilege of being best friends with someone you may know historically, Mario Savio, who was the fellow who stood on the Volkswagen at Berkeley and basically started free speech movement. We went to middle school, junior high school, and high school together. And Mario had the worst stutter of any human being I've ever seen. His eyes would roll up, and he would hack away for a minute or two. And his formidable brilliance was of such a caliber that eventually he became class president in a public school of 1,500 people in one class, just in our senior class. And he conquered his stutter. And when you see him on top of the Volkswagen, you'll see someone who isn't stuttering or has just traces of it. And it was remarkable. And as best friends, we lived through it. So at the end of our high school senior year, I was made class poet. I had written one or two poems, and Mario was most likely to succeed. But then in his success story, he was elevated to like class hero or the best of the lot, whatever it was. And I was thrust out of class poet into most likely to succeed, which was something that I could never imagine accomplishing, especially with my mother and father, who would never think I ever succeeded. So, so it went from there, and both Mario and I were kind of the movement people of our time that we knew from that background. And I became kind of a reporter for alternative newspapers, the National Guardian in New York, while I was at Bellevue, like Julie, and really trying to found the community health movement in the best sense of it, the community psychiatry movement, Lower East Side, all kinds of events, Medical Committee for Human Rights, New York Medical Committee, and the war in Vietnam. My life was about as political as could be, and one of the great transformative aspects of my life was when I went to my first demonstration and I suddenly felt caught up in it. And I left being a person of Queens, New York, and became a citizen of the world in the best sense of that belongingness that has stayed with me the rest of my life. So I did a lot of little writing stuff. I wrote on Cuba, I wrote on the movement, and then in the early 1980s, I got caught up with Sasha Shulgin, thank goodness, and that whole thing of the Arupa movement, the Association for Responsible Use of Psychedelic Agents, and we had our Esalen meetings, and we developed basically a core group of practitioners doing MDMA psychotherapy. I had been a family therapist and a systems therapist. I'd studied pretty much all over the world and been a therapist throughout my life. I actually began in medical school with a love of it coming out of my own initial experience and trying to expand it out of analytic and Freudian dimensions into a full systems theory. So coincidentally with that, in early 1984, my mother suddenly died of ovarian cancer, and my son, 6 months later, my oldest child, Noah, who was near 13, came down with ALL, acute lymphocytic leukemia. So there I was in the midst of this extraordinary movement with people who you all know who were influential in the beginnings of all this, from Rick and Claudio Naranjo and the Hefter folks. I was a founder of Hefter eventually, Dave Nichols, George Greer, on and on, Andy Weil. We had an amazing group of people, and it was very fertile soil. So I wrote a paper on family therapy and working with psychotic individuals with MDMA, which was one of the first papers of its sort. And then we were buried. We went underground. We tried to defend it. I was on national TV. And my son died. So my son died in 1988. And it was a long story. And if I was going to be a writer, my view of myself was this was my story. Sometimes you get stories. You were given the Rick story, Tom. You know, I was given my son's story, which was integrated in the whole MDMA world, because MDMA had been an important part of keeping ourselves sane to whatever extent we could stay sane. We would have family moments, and we lived in Noe Valley in San Francisco, where my wife Alice and I would do medicine. The kids would know what we're doing. We would hang out, you know, and I wrote about it. So I had this story, and it was lingering in me, and it was a difficult story. I had notes from bone marrow transplant. It was stolen, and I couldn't quite do it. I would write a little piece at a time. And I think the audience factor was still working very hard in me, and my own self-consciousness about whether I would write well. And it took a long time. But eventually I finished the book and published it in 2011, Noe, as a memoir. And people would ask me, did it obviate, did it take away my sense of loss? And I would say, no, it had nothing really to do with taking away a sense of loss. You don't take away that sense of loss. It's a stream that runs through you. But what it did do is it gave me a sense of trust in myself, that I would complete the work that I had promised myself, my son, to do. And so I could trust that I would write. And ever since then, I've been able to write. The next project was the Ketamine Papers book, and we're doing a new version of it. And I had been so involved in ketamine work as well as other substance work. Ketamine was not exclusive by any means. Wasca and everything else was in the mix. But ketamine is the only legal psychedelic, and in the realm of how we can use it as a profound medicine to benefit people, had become part and parcel of my life as a clinician. And that's what's continuing as we elaborate the use of ketamine as a psychotherapy, not as a drug, but as a 3-hour or so intensive work with people over time that benefits people of all stripes with all kinds of difficulties, because it's a profound out-of-body ego dissolution experience and allows people to reform and develop. So I'm pursuing that, and I'm writing a book that I call the little book of big grief, because I think we all suffer from grief in tiny ways to big ways, but we don't see how it influences us. And especially in this time of horrible trauma, horrible trauma, I think focusing on trauma, how we live with it, work with it, deal with it, collaborate together to build connection, community, love, and sharing is the essential work. So that's what I'm up to.
Thank you very much, Phil. You know, there's I'm hearing a couple of themes here that I wanna follow up on, and one is a sort of outing issue, but it seems minor in comparison to just talking about sort of where we are now as a society. What do we do now? It clearly things are building up. There's a bit of a crisis happening. I don't know if anyone's paying attention. It seems like you know, this one goes to 11. Talk about just trauma, protests, uprising, and perhaps not coincidentally, we are talking more and more about altered states of consciousness and ketamine and LSD and MDMA, and you know, these two things are sort of co-evolving, coexisting, and part of me can't help but sort of hope and delude myself into thinking that maybe one could be a solution to the other. And I wanted to know what people thought about that, but I'm going to ask you first, Chris, because I know you have to leave soon. Coincidence or no, that these two things are sort
Mhm.
of bubbling up simultaneously?
I don't think coincidence. I think there's a deeper synergy operating here. I don't think psychedelics will solve the crisis that we're entering into, but it can help us deepen our understanding and therefore our ability to participate consciously in this global crisis that we've entered. You know, in my personal work, um, a lot of my therapeutic work, a lot of the focus of the healing was not focused on anything to do with my individual history, but I was dissolved into work that it took me a long time to understand it, but I came to understand eventually that it was really focused on healing some aspect of the collective psyche. So a lot of my work has this collective dimension, a lot of healing of the scars of history, the scars of wars and the violence that we've perpetuated against each other. And from there, I went into long years of work journeying into what I call deep time, which is not eternity, but it's going outside of linear time into different epochs of time, experiencing 100 years as a simultaneous present or 100,000 years. And in that, the focus again was on our collective evolution, on our collective dynamic, which led me to write a chapter in this book called The Birth of the Future Human. And in a series of experiences, I was shown that we're at this turning point. We're coming to the Great Awakening. We're coming to a time of extraordinary shift in human consciousness, but it nowhere explained to me how we were ever going to make this transition. It was a huge evolutionary transition, but how to do it. And then it took me in one particular session in '95 deep into the future, which I experienced as I had dissolved into the collective unconscious. And so I experienced it as humanity as a total. And I experienced the death and rebirth of humanity. I experienced an absolute collapse of all of our social structures, a collapse that I thought I thought it would become an extinction event. That's how close to death it brought us. But the crisis peaked and passed, and it resulted in the unleashing of a profound sense of oneness in the human psyche, in the human species. And I began to experience what comes after this crisis, what this crisis is about, what humanity is in the process of actualizing. And I think there are many ways of describing this. But I think basically the soul is waking up inside time and space. Usually we are only conscious of our soul when we die, which is the soul, to me, is the consciousness that holds all of our incarnational experiences, all of our experiences over thousands and thousands of years. So we expand to the soul when we die, we shrink to ego when we're born, we expand to soul when we die, we shrink to ego. But if we keep this up long enough, keep going over thousands of years, sooner or later, our total consciousness awakens, I think, inside time and space. And I think this is the transition we're going through. This world culture that we've built was built by ego. And the ego is a magnificent thing, but it's ultimately a divided and it's a divisive psychological construct. And I think when the soul awakens, this deeper history awakens, and this deeper connectedness to each other, and this birth, a profound birth of oneness in the human heart, and an extraordinary openness to cosmological intelligence that takes place. So I think this is what we're about. That's my understanding of what is happening, and I think psychedelics are an important component of that. In that, it can help us see and understand the deep structure of this development. And it also has tremendous healing potential, so it can deepen and accelerate the purification that everybody is going through in this historical transition. So I don't see it as tempering it. Of course, the faster, the more of us move through this, the fewer of our children will die in the end. So it has extraordinary implications, but it actually, I think, has the dynamic of accelerating, not ameliorating, but accelerating this transformative process.
That sounds pretty hopeful and thorough, and I appreciate your assessment of that. Tom, do you want to weigh in at all on just sort of where we're at now, where we're at now culturally and psychedelically? Are you gonna?
I don't know. I mean, to me, the psychedelics has always come down to a realization of the moment and that of the supremacy of being in the moment, and that the just sort of the miracle of creation is so large and transcends all the things that are going on that make up our history and our concerns, our daily concerns, and that sort of like, I guess the sense is that paradise is here and now. It's all around us, and psychedelics help us be in that paradise, and and all these sort of things that we worry about on the day to day, and this sort of ugliness and all that stuff, on the biggest level, that's some kind of an illusion, and the reality is, in other words, I don't sense that we have to transform. We just have to be able to be in the moment, and that's what, to me, that's what psychedelics does. When under the influence of psychedelics, I can't even worry about the here and now because it's just engulfs you.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the value of it. And whether we're going to get through this horrible sort of stuff we're going through now, I don't know. But I feel like we are at a crisis point on that level. And, certainly the rest of my life is going to be impacted by what happens in the next few months.
Yes, and mine as well.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, I'll tell you, business is pretty good. If you're a psychiatrist right now, it's just, it's going to be busy. It's going to be a busy year, let's say. Francoise, do you want to talk a little bit about just sort of where we're at now culturally and psychedelically, and what your thoughts are?
Yeah. I mean, I echo what Chris and Tom said, of course. The time and space in psychedelic reality is obsolete and irrelevant. We are one. We are creating this reality, which is somehow an interesting construction of our inner psyche being projected on the collective screen. We have to see something inside ourselves individually, I think, that psychedelic can help us with in terms of our own trauma, our own cultural trauma, family trauma, transgenerational wounding. And that, my motto has been, helping society one soul at a time. That's kind of has been my thing. But in doing that, the micro and macro is the same, right? I mean, what we do for one person, we do for the collective. So everybody who is touched by psychedelic in a very real, integrated way, then brings that into whatever they touch. It's like a positive contagion or something, right? And so I believe that there's a transformation that happens on individual level that then is broadcasted, like I said, like spores, right? I mean, once you have one mushroom somewhere, there's millions of spores that are really disseminated. And I believe in the power of that, the power of this dissemination of consciousness and action, not just consciousness, but like integrated consciousness in real life, like the way we talk, the way we love each other, the way we support one another. For me, this is a very embodied, practical practice, not just some kind of have a good trip now, but how do we participate and how do we, walk our talk, so to speak, right? So I like that angle. I believe, I'm not a historian even of the American Society for sure, because I wasn't here for it, but in my understanding and in my knowledge of it, when psychedelic came about, society was very different, and it backlashed. There was not a lot of safety enough or enough conversation. It was a very contracted time in America, and so it kind of exploded rapidly and then kind of contracted upon itself. And now, with the diligence of the researchers and the conversation that have been coming up in the last 20 years, I should say, pretty much since, I want to say, since Charles Grob and Gary Bravo studied at UCLA or UC Irvine, in 92 with MDMA, since that time, I think there has been a reopening of the curiosity towards psychedelic that is very different, very differently handled. And that's why we're seeing the predominance of research as a path, because it's done so diligently and so methodically that in a way it cannot be, well, it can, of course, everything can, but it's on good tracks to be legitimized. And then with that, there is a destigmatization in what Rick is doing and what the underground psychedelic field has been holding, and what Phil and Ralph did, and all this, and what you guys have been writing about. This is a movement that has a different, I don't know if seriousness is the word, but a different integration in society, and people listen differently. And what you've written, Julie, and like, this is a different age, and this is social media. People connect very rapidly, and information is disseminated rapidly. And I think this works in our favor of really being able to, broadcast this kind of dialogue out. And so I think that the world is in a direction that's actually positive in terms of psychedelic potential of healing and support. But again, I think that the Black Lives Matters is a very interesting phenomena, more than a phenomena, it's a drama, of course, but it's also a phenomena because it brings people inward to really look at their own bias and their own limitation. I mean, I have a Black child, right? I adopted a Black child. So I know what it's like to live with a Black child and what that means to have that reality in my very own family. And that's really mobilizing, and I'm a white woman, my husband is white, and here we are having a Black child. So that conversation is really bringing up to the surface the shadow side of each one of us. And I think that this is tragic, as we see from the latest tragedy, but it is also important that people are looking at their own shadow one by one, because that's going to be how we're gonna come through. But like you said, Tom, this is here now, and this is all we have, and this is heavenly, and this is our creation, and we create the dark as much as we create the beauty. So why do we create if everything is a result of our inner creation, right? Inner projection of our reality. This is just Maya, right? How do we then relate to what we create as a reflection of ourselves? So I'm interested in that healing. And that's why I'm so, impressed and supportive of Rick or everybody doing psilocybin research, which is more my field, and I've been involved with MAPS for many years, but also, because I believe this is what we need. We need healing. It's hard to grow when there is survival mode of panic and not being able to, like you said, Julie, in your book, like it's hard to spiritually be, wonderfully informed when we're afraid for our kids. It's hard. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Don, would you like to weigh in on this issue?
Sure. From a personal point of view, I have found psychedelics to be very healing therapeutically. Specifically, I have been using ketamine therapy pretty much, on my own, with the doctor's supervision, but on my own, once a week, an hour-long ketamine session with music and eye shades. And I found this for myself to be a way to really transcend my melancholy and to find meaning and connection and gratitude these are the feelings that I feel on these sessions that I have. And I have, basically gotten off traditional antidepressants. And so I feel a lot of gratitude for that. And I think for me, it's been very effective. And, like what you feel in the psychedelic state is this, this remembering and retrieving and recollecting and bringing things together and finding meaning in all these parts of your life.
Yeah.
When you're depressed, you don't see that. So it's like the opposite of depression.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it is temporary. And that's one of the, critiques of this, especially with ketamine, I think. But there is a memory of that. And what I do in my own life is I remember, oh yeah, the music is such a part of this. Not just the playlist during the trip, but I remember to pick up my guitar and sing and do my Tai Chi and get that bodily energy sense that I do feel with the ketamine. And it is very healing for me personally. And so, and I've had other experiences with, more traditional psychedelics in similar ways. But on the other hand, there's this journalist in me, there's this skeptic in me, which really kind of wants to step back and say, okay, that's true, but are psychedelics prompting this shift in consciousness, really, when you look at what's going on in the world? I mean, I don't think psychedelics changed the world, saved the world in the 1960s at all. And I don't personally see it happening on a large scale in the 2020s either, when you really look at what's going on in the world, in our culture. And I think we really have to watch out, not make that same mistake we made in the 60s, this kind of irrational exuberance about it. Because one of the things that psychedelics do is, yes, they ego dissolution and kind of cosmic connection, an amazing kind of insight like Chris was talking about. That's true. I mean, that is true on a very deep level, but we have to go, but it's so easy to like switch into this kind of grandiosity almost around it. Psychedelics can dissolve the ego, but also can fuel grandiosity. I mean, look what happened with Timothy Leary, right? There's a classic case. The grandiosity, the Messiah kind of took over in him. And so that's sort of a personal struggle I always have as a journalist. I was very skeptical of everything. Now that I'm trying to write about and honor my own personal experience, I do see the value in this, but I think we have to be careful in our sales job around. It's not even, I'm not even doing a sales job. I'm not in the business, right? I'm not a therapist. I'm not a researcher, but I just think we have to kind of keep some perspective and look at what's happening outside our little, psychedelic bubble, whether it's the Bay Area, Marin County, or whatever, and what's really going on in the world. And it's not a very pretty picture right now, as we know. And yes, I think psychedelics can be very healing and transformative on an individual level, but I think we have to just keep some perspective about what's really happening in the world. And there's also the critique that psychedelics kind of turn people away from politics and social activism. I mean, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, there were two camps. There was the new left, there was the political left, and then there was the psychedelic counterculture. And I mean, the whole human being in San Francisco was designed to bring together those two camps. So there was that split then. And, there's some people that are very critical, like, Bob Forte is very critical of the movement that psychedelics have taken because they've taken people away from politics. You don't have to go into all the conspiracy theories around it. But I mean, I think that's a valid criticism that they can do that. They can. I think the challenge that we face is to bring this together. And I think, Phil, you've talked about that, and you do that in your life and your work with politics and with psychedelics, and try to integrate. You're talking about personal integration, but
right?
Socially integrate.
That's the word I was.
Maybe I could pick up on that, Don, because I think that's really apt, and I won't be too long-winded. We're confronting the worst trauma that we've ever confronted, both from global climate change and mass uprootings of human beings and suffering beyond anything that we can imagine. And the six of us are pretty much in our little libraries looking pretty happy and privileged. And
yes, let's all acknowledge our privilege before we continue. Yes.
And, heartbreaking things happen. Broke my heart yesterday to see that father shot 7 times in the back by cops who had their hands on them in front of 3 children. That kind of horror is pervasive. And the COVID horror is pervasive. And here we're pretending nothing's happened. We've lost over 170,000 people. Whole countries are in swaths of destruction at this point. And so when we were looking at how we could spread the work of the Ketamine Research Foundation, which is sponsoring this program, we really came up with the limitations that Don is alluding to in terms of how deep psychedelics have spread in the world, who are competent practitioners, where they exist, and what their influence is. And I think there is a great influence, and I think the influence relates a lot to a meditative equanimity, meditative stability, that psychedelics create a distance from our attachments and enable us to really relook at our attachments and to reform and say, who am I? What's real for me? Where am I connected? Who am I really dependent on? And in the best sense of that. But it's also limited. MAPS is not going to be successful until early 2023 now, Rick said yesterday, late 2022, same with psilocybin. Ketamine's out there, but we have so few practitioners able to work with ketamine that we can't really spread the results to be an anti-trauma kind of campaign. So what we're doing, we're going to be presenting it in this Infinite Playa, is we're starting a worldwide anti-trauma facilitated group psychotherapy. It's not really psychotherapy, but group experiential kind of program of 6 sessions, which we're hoping to do all over the world. And because we finally have come to understand that trauma is the main force impacting human beings into suffering, that if we take trauma on and build connection as much as we can and build sharing as much as we can, within that framework, there'll be consciousness of psychedelic work, but there'll be a coming together in connection and some degree of healing and alleviation of suffering. So because it's upon us and we need to do things that are beyond the capacity of our psychedelic work to encompass them, we're doing this. We call it Indra's Neck Coalition, for the fact that we're all jewels and we need to light us up, each of us, to be connected in the world. So I hope you'll look at that as we go through this week. It's going to take a lot of work to make it happen, but I think the more we can bring people together to share the kinds of suffering, whether it's COVID or trauma or global climate change or whatever, we have the capacity as therapists and as writers to bring people together to really share with each other and develop the kind of connections that lead to activism.
You know, I'm just thinking about this idea of integration and how you know, we need to talk the walk, basically, that the lessons of psychedelics are things, you know, like unity and oneness, and that the separations are illusions. And you know, the goal for some people when they have these mystical experiences, or perhaps the byproduct or benefit of these experiences, is this ego disintegration. And the question, I think, maybe was brought up by Don, which is very, very reasonable, and I've heard it before, which is, these substances are supposed to, you know, kill the ego. Why are there such big egos in the psychedelic community? So, you know, it does come back to this thing about walking the talk. Like, you know, we get these lessons. Eden is here and now. Paradise is here. Gratitude, openness, interdependence, equanimity, acceptance. Yes, these are all like great things that we learn. But, you know, how do we make spores and, you know, spread this sort of message and actually live the message that, you know, that we're getting in these altered states? I don't have a great answer for, you know, this idea of integration, but I just, you know, we're all, you know, it's such a watchword now. It's like it's trending, you know, this idea of integration, and there is integration of the self, you know, all these different facets of the self that maybe come together, and I mean, that was certainly my experience. My early personal work with MDMA was I spent a lot of time sort of figuring out how I had different personas, you know, and how to make sure that they were integrated. So that's one kind of integration. And then, you know, racial integration is another kind of integration, and everybody working together and getting along together, and not seeing all these delineations and separations, but appreciating that we are all one species, we are all sharing the planet, things like this. Phil, I'm intrigued by this idea of sort of large group psychotherapy sessions. Are you talking about sort of technologically facilitated group experiences?
The foundation is going to support a facilitated 6 to 10 person group experience of 6 sessions duration throughout the world. We're doing Black Lives Matter as an example of how to do this. We're doing COVID-19, and we're working with ICEers to conduct this first Spanish language module that we'll send out as exemplars to people of how to do this. So we're collecting money, and we're going to sponsor facilitators, and it's free, and hopefully it'll grow into a big movement. So you'll hear more about it if you stay tuned to the Infinite Playa and the K-Dome Microdome, which is what we're all on.
I absolutely, I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by this idea. I know that some people are having sort of Zoom facilitated ayahuasca circles where everybody is in their own place, but they are playing Icaros and being together. You know, everyone's keeping their laptops open while they have their own.
It's hard to do ketamine groups that way. We've done so many large groups, and you know, things happen, and we can't run to the aid of people if they're sick or they're agitated. So we've done individual sessions or couple sessions at home, supervised for 3 hours on Zoom. It's a terrible ordeal.
It's pretty draining.
But we've been doing it, but it's small scale.
I'm glad to hear you use the word free, Phil, because I mean, one of the problems with this therapy, whether it's underground or not, I mean, it's very expensive, and it really is, from what I can see, kind of an elitist kind of a thing, and because it takes a lot of time to do this right. I mean, you look at the clinical trial model that they use at MAPS, 2 therapists for 8 hours. I mean, okay, if Rick Doblin's dream comes true, and that somehow not just get this decriminalized, but get insurance to pay for it, okay, then maybe. But until you get to there, I mean, I'm a white male. I have a lot of privilege, but you know, I'm retired. I'm a writer. You know, I don't have a lot of money. I can't even afford underground psychedelic.
We've been talking about this like on the commercialization panel yesterday. We really need a national health service to be able to you know, really actualize doing psychedelic psychotherapy in any rigorous kind of way. Individuals won't be able to support it. Within the Ketamine Research Foundation, we have an access to care program, which is small, based on donations to really cut costs for people, but it's small potatoes. We really need an overall kind of national health service to accomplish this.
And one Ralph Metzner is, last time I interviewed Ralph Metzner, he was talking about, he was critical of a lot of the medicalization and all this, and he was saying like a 12-step model, you know, a self-help model of groups like, say, veterans getting together on their own and doing these rituals and this healing together. You know, you don't really need a doctor to do this. I mean, you don't. And then people are doing that anyway. So that's the whole other model that people do. That's
underground, you know, Don. The problem is it's underground. Ketamine by prescription. We are doing a vets program, which we're going to start in cooperation with a vets organization as a pilot program for how to do groups for vets. So that's coming, but you're entirely right. We need something very different.
I think also what I'm feeling
Chris
also
has got to go. Chris is going.
Could I just throw in something, because I have to leave here? First, affirming, yes, the great danger of working with psychedelics is psychic inflation, and to really hold and sit still and internalize and let these things sink deeper and deeper into your heart. I never ever say anything public about any of my experiences unless I've sat with them at least 5 years, preferably 10. It just takes a long time to absorb and stabilize. Second thing I want to mention is in terms of the social, the broader impact, I wrote a book called The Living Classroom, which doesn't mention psychedelics, but the background story to the book is, even though my students never knew I was doing this psychedelic work, I found that my psychedelic work was activating my students in the classroom in all sorts of different ways. And I had to learn what was happening, and I had to come to understand what was happening and to actively manage what was happening, to deal with. So integration is not just personal psychological integration, it's social integration, taking responsibility for everybody who's touched by the work that one or the other of us do. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that teaching at a university, I'm very aware that the universities in this country are teaching a religion, and that religion is reductive materialism. And that is an extremely corrosive philosophy. It's a philosophy that just saps people of their life, of their will to live, and their hopes and dreams for a better world. It's a terribly ugly philosophy, and yet it is considered normative in our academic institutions. And psychedelics can break that. They really, even, a mystical experience may not a mystic make, and Houston Smith was right, but a mystical experience does a philosophical reductive materialist unmake pretty quickly. And that's, if we can change the fundamental convictions of the zeitgeist of our time, if we can change, instead of seeing the universe as dead matter, as living and consciously aware, and that evolution is not a random mutation, accidental process, but an act of supreme brilliance and creativity, then that opens up an entire context in which we can revision the deeper projects of life on so many different levels. And I just want to express my deep appreciation to all of you for this conversation. I'm sorry that I have to leave. Really, really have enjoyed it. Would love to have more conversation with each of you. Much love.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your contribution. Francoise, if you can pick up where you left off.
Yeah, no, I'm really appreciating what Chris just talked. I mean, it was like, okay, here we are, with his words. Talking about really education, which is a lot of what my life is about. Education, training guides, creating curriculum, broadcasting ideas. I think it's a lot of education, a lot of destigmatization, and really talking about psychedelic in a way that is reassuring to people, that is not, that is a different conversation from, some decades ago. What I was thinking about in terms of access, and, we are creating an initiative in my community and family around broadcasting, scaling of trainings and access and inclusivity. It is the idea of applying psychedelic principle, like we are one, we are in a spirit of solidarity, and we really are, needing to support one another, because we can't do it alone. We are one. We as a human family or as a planet, it's not, I cannot, deny what your care is, Julie, or your situation, and think that I'm going to do my life. It's the Black Lives Matters is also, of course, Black Lives Matter, but it's also human life matters, right? And how we are really unified in the spirit of psychedelic knowledge. And in that spirit, I think what needs to happen is the sharing of resources and wealth. I think, I tell people who have come to me for experiences, people who are very wealthy, I said, if you want to be a psychedelic, if you call yourself a psychedelic person impacted by psychedelics, then you got to put your money where your mouth is, and you got to be able to support, to share your wealth. How many millions do you need to be happy? I mean, if you have 10 millions, would that be sufficient for the rest of your life? And can you dedicate the rest to support humanity and be a truly psychedelic person, or whatever that word is, So I'm really, my social motivational speaking has to do with this, like we should be able to share, and whoever has resources pays more, and whoever doesn't have resources pays less. In my community, that's how things go. People want to train. African-American people want to join our trainings. They don't have the means because they work for their brothers in San Quentin. Well, they train for free. We're just kind of looking at the overall result of things and trusting that whoever shows up should be trained, should be given the tools to affect their community. So, and people who have more money pay more. And you know what? They're very happy to do so because
Right.
they know that it's just not about themselves, it's about the sharing. So that's a walking that talk immediately applied to how they're gonna, we have a thing called Soul Seed Fund. And this is a pool of money that supports whoever wants this approach. You want to go to Mexico with me, you don't have the money, go to Mexico with me. You want to do a journey with someone, you do a journey. You want to be trained, you be trained. Nobody's ever refused. And that actually, that mentality of really applying the unity consciousness into the money part is really very touching and very efficient. So it's not just, we don't even now, we have never worked with donations because this system has always worked over all our
I
years.
hate to interrupt, but we're gonna have, why don't we have a little wrap up because we're gonna run out.
Yeah,
of time.
I got to go as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
You know, I really do appreciate this idea that if people want to donate, there are places they can donate, that there are these money pools so that people who don't have the money can go. So I would, be very happy to publicize these sort of possibilities because I do think the marginalized people who can't afford the underground work, and right now insurance is not reimbursing and they really don't have an option.
Mhm.
I'm hoping one of my life's work will be to get psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, a CPT code, and get it reimbursable, and show the insurance companies. I'm sorry that it's plural. I would love at some point if it was just one insurance company, but show that this is cost effective, if nothing else. That clearly, taking medicines every day and being not very productive isn't as good as 1 or 2 sessions, and then you are, back in the game. So I do think there's a way to eventually subsidize this sort of treatment. And also, yes, we all agree that 2 therapists with 1 client for 8 hours, that's how you do the research. That's not really how you're going to end up sort of disseminating the healing. That we will have to do group work. We will have to have different ratios of clients and practitioners. And it would be lovely if these things were reimbursable.
So what are you going to write about next, Julie? Let's end up with being writers.
Doesn't every writer here love that question? Isn't that just like,
Yeah.
what's next? I'm
What's
like, I'm
next?
trying to pitch this book. What's next? Great. So my partner, Jeremy, and I are talking about trying to write a book together about coupledom and duality and staying in a relationship, even though it's immensely challenging, and what the challenges are, how, what is the nature of relationship, how do we practice interdependence, without freaking out. So I don't have an elevator pitch yet. It's August, and my decision was that is starting September, we're going to sit down and talk about, the book proposal. So it's still
I've been very worried about Don Lattin because he's taken a leave from the field, and I think his writing has been wonderful, valuable, great contribution. So I hope, maybe, Don, you're a little encouraged to keep going and maybe, start something that's exciting to you. I hope you'll keep writing because you've been of great benefit to all of us.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Phil. No, I'm still writing. I'm not worrying about getting it published or getting an advance for it, which I've been lucky. My other books, I've always gotten in some advance, sometimes a generous advance, but those days are over, apparently, for me, at least for me. So it's actually freed me up to write. I'm working on a little bit of fiction. I'm writing about my ancestors. I'm having a great time writing, but you may never see it, but that's okay.
Well, I hope we do. How about
I'll
you?
show it to you, Phil. Don't worry.
Okay. How about you, Tom?
Oh, well, I'm not actively working on anything in the psychedelic field. I'm helping some authors write a book about what we need to do to get to carbon zero by 2050. Basically, they're emphasizing the fact that it's possible, that we have the technological means to do it, and it's just a matter of political and individual will. And I'm also helping somebody write about the legacy of slavery, as in particular with Georgetown University, that literally sold the slaves that they own, this Jesuit order, down the river to horrible bondage, separating families. And this woman was able to trace the history of some slaves that were sold and their descendants. Fascinating book. And also a book that's being written by a New Yorker writer about Joe Biden's relationship with his two sons, Beau and Hunter. So interesting projects. And personally, I've actually been writing a few screenplays just so I can muddle around in that complete waste of space that is the Hollywood entertainment.
It could be more fun.
Amen. Amen.
And Francoise, what about you, Francoise? What are you writing?
I don't have any writing ambition at the moment. I'm interested in ecology and social change, and what we call integration. Maybe what integration is really defining. So I don't know. That might be called integration. Something, you say like write a book is love, and now I'm going to write integration, the big word of the decade.
Exactly. Right.
And maybe that's, I don't know, I'm really passionate about it, but we'll see. It doesn't coalesce yet, but that's to
And
share.
I'm doing a volume 2, the new ketamine papers, which I think is going to be very exciting because so much great stuff has happened in the 4 years, not just with ketamine, but in the generation of ideas and feelings and culture around it. So I'm excited to get the contributions coming in and to have a new book that hopefully, if I can get my shit together, I will finish by the fall. So,
yeah. If I can get my shit together is a great title for a book right there.
Exactly.
So it's like the ultimate self-help book. Tom, you mentioned screenplays in Hollywood, and I was just thinking like we could have a whole separate panel on, trying to write for TV or trying to get psychedelics presented in a
in fact,
non-stigmatizing way. So is anything psychedelic
Acid
related?
Test is actually in development with Vice Films, and the screenplay has been written, and they're trying to put together a director and some stars to help get it made. But the good news was that Vice Films has money, and they made a production deal with them. So hopefully that will happen.
Great.
Our beloved friend Lou Carlino wrote a screenplay that he hasn't been able to produce yet, but he started to do on psychedelics and his daughter and the daughter's death. And Lou wrote The Great Santini and Resurrection, and is getting very old up on Whidbey. But there are people trying to do it. People trying to do it.
I'd be interested to hear what you all think is the best depiction of the psychedelic experience that you've ever seen in film.
Well,
Fantastic Fungi goes up there.
Fantastic Fungi was really beautiful to watch. I really, really thought that was a great feature. I'm definitely a fan of Darren Aronofsky, and I think that better than many, he does depict altered states pretty well. And somewhat like Mother, to me, was just a trip start to finish. But he comes to mind. And there's some animators, I think, that do a pretty good job. But, I really would like to have a separate panel on this. I'm really invested in there being good scripted dramas that depict psychedelic assisted psychotherapy in a way that is accurate and not stigmatizing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Julie, we'll leave it to you to organize.
All right, I'll get right on that.
So we do have to stop.
Okay.
You want to say a concluding comment first?
But this has been just a delight getting to meet you all and listening to you. It's a wonderful group. Really a privilege to be part of it.
I appreciate all your work. I appreciate all our work and all the writers that have come before us. And I know, that we all really value our book collections and our knowledge. And I'm happy to be in this group, sort of spreading the good word.
Yeah, same here. It was great spending an hour and a half with you all. On the film front, I was just going to mention that Harvard Psychedelic Club has been optioned again for a film, and this time it was looking like something might actually happen. So I've been thinking about how to depict
Well, of course.
states, but then of course Hollywood shut down, so who knows?
Right. That's the other thing.
All right. Well,
All
may
right.
that
Thanks,
happen.
guys.
All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Phil. Thank you, Phil,
everyone.
for enabling this. I appreciate it. Thank you, Helix, for technologically supporting it also.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.